So as we continue on to these conceptual frameworks, we have models of function and disability. So the framework for structuring effects of health condition on aspects of function in an individual. Disablement is the impact of the disease on human functioning at many different levels. And then what's the goal of therapeutic intervention? Optimize function and maximize participation. So the World Health Organization model, so that's the WHO model. There's the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, which is the ICF. And the language and framework to describe how people with the health condition function in their daily lives. So even the APTA has adapted this ICF model. Now the other one was the model of practice model, and now here's the ICF model. Again, these are just conceptual frameworks. One is not better than the other, but this just like the theories. But part 1 is on functioning and disability. Part 2 is on contextual factors. Now, so if you look at this, right, functioning and disability components, body functions and structures, activities and participation, domains, what are the body function structures, what are the life areas, constructs, changes in body functions, physiological, changes in body structures, anatomical, right? What's the capacity for executing tasks in a standard environment, then performance executing tasks in the current environment. So how are they performing now versus how can they? Positive aspect, functional and structural integrity, activities participation, and then the negative aspect, impairments, disability. Now, that's functioning, but there's contextual factors sometimes that we don't have control over. Sometimes there's environmental factors. If it rains, you can't control that. Personal factors, if they're in a bad mood, sometimes you can't control that. There's external influences on functioning and disability. There's internal influences on functioning and disability. What else can? Facilitating or hindering impact of features of the physical, social, and attitudinal world. Impact of attributes of the person. Sometimes there's environmental factors that are facilitators, and then sometimes there's environmental factors that are barriers or hindrances in a negative aspect. Right? So it all depends. All these play a factor in how well our patient's going to do and what are the factors that will lead them to do better. This is why some patients do better than others. Maybe their environmental factor is better. Maybe their personal factors are not as important. Okay? So it just depends. And we as therapists need to understand all these factors. And you can't always blame the patient and say, oh, they're not getting better because they don't do their exercise at home. Sometimes it's not that easy. There's a lot to recovery that we need to understand. And these models help us understand that. So the World Health Organization Part 1, which is body functions, that's the physiological and the psychological functions of the body. There's 9 domains of activities and participation. The capacity is ability in standard or uniform environment, and performance, ability in a person's actual environment. Part 2 is the contextual factors. It's environmental and personal that can modify and influence the effect of a health condition. Environmental, external to individual, includes physical, social, and attitudinal factors. Again, the World Health Organization Clinical Implications provides a conceptual framework for examining the effect of a health condition on an individual, provide common language for communicating information, and improve our ability to be understood by both clinicians and non-clinicians. So it's just not mumbo jumbo to someone that is not in the PT world. So how would you apply the ICF model to your case study, right? If you have Janice, if you have Bonnie, Mike, Sue, okay, what you would do is basically define the health condition of the disease or injury. So whether they had a stroke, whether they had Parkinson's, whether they have cerebral palsy. Then you would make a list of probable impairments, limitations in body structure and function associated with the disease. What do you think those lists would be? What are those impairments? Then you say, well, how will the limitations in the body structure and function change as a patient moves from the acute stage to chronic? Is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse? What functional activities are likely to be affected given the range of impairments? What will the patient's level of participation be? Will the person be restricted or disabled in the role? And consider all the contextual factors such as environment and personal factors that may influence the patient. So there's a lot of things that will influence your rehab, and when you train for your case study and when you write it, here's how you can do the international CF model framework. Okay. Now, so if you look at this, there's a lot of things going on here, right? So these are all the things that can affect a patient's ability. So the health condition, well, there's a whole bunch of them, right? There's various disorders: Parkinson's, cerebral palsy, stroke, CVA, whatever the case may be. What's the goal and the interest? Individual needs, wants, increased mobility and independence, inquiring about power, mobility, information. So their body function is cognitive. Are they cognitive? Their orientation, attention, memory, vision testing, test reflexes, range of motion, tone, and joint mobility. So you would test that here. Structures. Is there an impairment or change of the body structure? Okay. And that would influence the activity, right? So depending on how cognitive they are, what their vision is, what their range of motion is, well, that'll affect executing tasks. That'll affect their ability to complete ADLs, learn how to transfer on and off a mobility device, hands-on drivers training a mobility device, okay, regarding chairs and maintenance. So your body functions will affect activity. Activity may affect body functions, right? Everything's interconnected. Now, executing the task, completing ADLs, will tell me how much are they going to participate in the real world. Are they going to go to bridge? Are they going to go out with their friends? Are they going to go eat? Are they abiding by the road rules? Communicating with others, therapists, vendors, right? Maintain or increase role within community. Or are they pretty much homebound and they don't go anywhere? Okay. Now these contextual factors will influence the body function, the activity, and the participation. So what are those environmental factors? There's a whole bunch. Product and technology, vendors, website information, natural environment and human-made changes, home modification, support, family caregivers, coping strategies, attitudes, social norms, road rules, universal design, safety education, pamphlets, right? Yeah. Do they have access to that? And then personal factors, not part of classification, but can influence really their function. So what's their age, gender, coping style, social background, education, profession, past experience, character, style, and habits. So all these contextual factors will definitely influence this. So look at your case studies and say, well, what are some personal factors of my case study that might affect their activity levels? What are some environmental factors that might affect their activity, and their activity will affect their body function, and the activity will affect their participation in the community? So this is a good model. Now, the hypothesis-oriented, this is the example I gave you a couple of weeks ago where I said, okay, you have a flashlight, and the flashlight doesn't work. So you have two options. Either it's the bulb or it's the battery, right? Well, you have to make a hypothesis that it's the battery. So what do? Well, you change the battery, then you turn on the flashlight again. If the bulb turns on, then your hypothesis was correct. If the bulb does not turn on, then you need to make a new hypothesis and say maybe this time it's the bulb. Okay, so hypothesis-oriented clinical practice. Hypothesis is a proposal to explain certain facts or one possible explanation of causes of a patient's client's problems. Why can't they reach? Okay, so you're saying, why can't they reach into their cabinet? Then you can say, well, it's a range of motion issue. Okay, so then you work on the range of motion. If that doesn't work, like they still can't reach, then you say, okay, let's change that. I thought it was a range of motion issue, but now the range of motion is fine, but it's a strength issue. Okay, so then you try that, and then you go with that. But you have to set up some kind of hypothesis, and you have to be able to test it. So how does a clinician or non-clinician clarify the cause of motor control problems in individuals with neurological dysfunction? Limitations of clinical tests. So you do some testings, and there's a lot of limitations of these clinical tests. So what is the impairment and limitation that leads to that poor gait, for instance? So let's say they're walking crappy. So your hypothesis can be, well, they have a weak anterior tibialis, so you strengthen them, okay? Or their gastroc or calves can be tight, right? So then you would test that, so you would stretch it out. Or they could have a problem coordinating the anterior tibialis muscle with the postural response energy. So that's a neurological issue. So if you look at 1 and 2, we can fix 1 and 2, but 3 might take some time. So understanding what the real problem of why they're walking poorly then gives us the ability to say how long is it going to take to fix this problem. So how do you apply the conceptual framework to practice? There's theory of motor control provides framework of assumptions. Model of practice identifies the steps to follow during the course of intervention. The model of health-related function disability provides a systematic way for examining diverse effects of pathology. And then the hypothesis-oriented practice helps us explore the relationship among the levels. So the theories of motor control and learning, understanding of neural basis for movement control and learning underlying reacquisition of skill. This conceptual framework for structuring clinical practice must be dynamic. Okay. Now, there's evidence-based clinical practice, which is philosophical approach to clinical practice that integrates best available research, clinician expertise, and client characteristics, critical in ensuring clinical practice consistent with the evolving research basis for the field. I love evidence-based clinical practice because I like to look that up in our movement anatomy class. For example, I showed them the best EMG exercises that are related to a bench press. So, you know, if you want to target the right muscles, we want to know, what does the evidence say? So what are the best exercises to target hamstrings, quads, biceps? What does the evidence say? So then applying it to our situation with the neurological, what are the best exercises for someone with cerebral palsy? What are the best exercises for someone that's had a stroke? What's the time frame, right? Are they on track? So evidence-based clinical practice is actually very helpful because they've tested hundreds and hundreds of patients with the same diagnoses. And although their impairments might be the same or different, it gives us a good framework of what to practice and try. Now, a task-oriented approach is a multifaceted approach to clinical management of motor control problems in patients with CNS pathology. So the task-oriented approach is evaluation of functional activities and participation, description of strategies used to accomplish functional skills, and then quantification of underlying sensory, motor, and cognitive impairments. So a task-oriented approach is probably one that you'll use in the clinic a lot. And a task-oriented approach to examination assessment. A task-oriented approach to examination looks at motor behavior at several levels. What's their functional ability? What are the strategies used to accomplish functional tasks? Quantitative underlying, what's the sensory, motor, and cognitive impairment that can strain functional movement? So there's no one test that can accomplish all these goals. Therefore, we must do a battery of tests and measures must be used. This drives programming, and it's mostly by constraints. So again, we have to do a whole bunch of tests to accomplish all these goals. So how do you choose which tests? So examination of functional activities and participation. The ability of the individual to perform essential tasks and activities in standard clinical environment and person's actual environment. Performance-based measures, patient's ability to perform functional tasks. Examination of functional activities and participation. focuses on measuring the ability of the individual to perform essential tasks and activities in both a standard and actual environment. Approach can be quantitative, qualitative, or a combination. Okay, interview and self-report. Performance-based measures. A high correlation has been found between the two types of approaches. So again, in talking with the task-oriented approach to exams, how do we measure participation? Right? So participation defined with reference to behavior in social and physical contexts, both objective and subjective dimensions. What does that mean? So an important aspect of examination of patients with motor control problems is examining the effect of a health condition within the context of a person's life. Limitations in functional activities are defined by the individual's capacity to do specific tasks and activities in a standardized environment, while participation is defined with reference to behavior in a social and physical context. So, measuring participation and its inverse disability is often difficult because of a lack of both a clear operational definition and valid methods. So, participation has both objective and subjective dimensions. What does that mean? Well, traditional measures of participation and disability often focus on the objective dimensions, quantifying frequency of participation or level of independence in performing ADL. For example, Late Life Functional Disability Instrument is an example of a measure designed to quantify activities and participation. An example of a measure of a disability that could be used with children is the Pediatric Evaluation of Disability Inventory. So there's a lot of these tests and a lot of these surveys out there that we can use. And based on your case study, you'll be able to look at a whole bunch of these and say which one is the best. So participation has both objective and subjective dimensions. What specific tests and measures will you be used based on your case study's diagnosis, level of function, and age? The task and measures to be used could be clearly identified in Section 3 of your case study project. So this will obviously lead to your case study. So this will be very good. Now, clinical measures of function, there's task-specific tests and measures, age-specific tests and measures, there's diagnosis-specific tests and measures, and there's choosing appropriate tests and measures and limitations of tests and measures. So what are all these tests that, Patel, you keep talking about? It says, well, how do I measure this stuff? Okay, so we got to break it down. And when it comes down to it, in order for us to decide what we want to do with our patient, we have to do a certain amount of tests. And these tests will guide us as to where we want to go. Okay, so tests and measures can be task-specific, transfer movements. They can be age-specific, which means reliable with older adults and or younger people. And they can be diagnosis-specific. Is it MS, or is it Parkinson's, or is it sclerosis? So you can have different tests that are specific just to a diagnosis, just to an age, or just to a task.